The dive started at 22,000 feet. Lieutenant James "Pappy" Boyington, no relation to the famous Corsair ace, though he'd heard the joke 1,000 times, pushed the control stick of his Republic P-47 Thunderbolt forward until the airframe groaned in protest. The altimeter unwound like a broken clock. 20,000, 18, 15. His squadmates were still circling above the Japanese formation, calculating angles, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Pappy didn't wait. He never did. This was July 1945. Over the Philippine Sea, in the final desperate months before the war's end, the Japanese knew they were losing. That made them more dangerous, not less. Cornered animals fight hardest when the trap closes. Pappy understood that. He'd grown up on a wheat farm in eastern Kansas, and he'd seen what a wounded coyote could do when you got careless. The Zero fighters below him hadn't spotted the American patrol yet, 8 of them, flying in a loose formation that spoke of fuel conservation and dwindling pilot training hours. They were heading north, probably limping back to Formosa after a reconnaissance run. In the old days, 1942, 1943, those same pilots would have been veterans, men who'd cut their teeth over China and perfected their craft at Pearl Harbor. Now they were farm boys too, kids pulled from rice paddies and given 6 weeks of instruction before being shoved into a cockpit and told to die for the Emperor. Pappy's engines screamed. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, 18 cylinders of American industrial might, could take punishment that would tear a lighter fighter apart. The Thunderbolt wasn't graceful, it wasn't nimble, but it was fast in a dive, faster than almost anything else in the Pacific Theater, and it could absorb damage that would shred a Zero like wet paper. 12,000 feet. His wingman's voice crackled over the radio. "Pappy, what the hell are you doing? We're supposed to coordinate the attack." Pappy didn't answer. There wasn't time to explain what he'd seen, what his instincts were screaming at him. The Japanese formation was too tight. They were conserving fuel, yes, but they were also protecting something. One of those Zeros was different, heavier, flying lower than the others, struggling to maintain altitude. A reconnaissance bird, maybe, loaded with photographs or intelligence that command would kill to intercept. 10,000 feet. The Thunderbolt shuddered. He could feel the airframe flexing, the wings bending under forces they weren't designed to endure for long. Pappy had pushed birds harder than this before. He'd also seen planes come apart in mid-air, wings folding like paper, pilots spinning down in fragments of aluminum and steel. The farm had taught him about risk. His father had been a careful man, the kind who checked every bolt twice and never took shortcuts. That caution had kept the farm running through the Dust Bowl, through the Depression, through seasons when half their neighbors lost everything. But Pappy had also watched his older brother die from a burst appendix because the nearest doctor was 40 miles away, and the careful decision was to wait until morning rather than drive through a thunderstorm at night. Sometimes careful got you killed, just as dead as reckless. 8,000 feet. The Zeros were growing in his gun sight. He could make out individual aircraft now, see the rising sun emblems on their wings, the variation in their paint schemes. The leader was flying a newer model, relatively fresh paint. The others showed wear, patches, the kind of field repairs that spoke of spare parts shortages and maintenance crews working miracles with whatever they could scavenge. Pappy's thumb moved to the gun button. The P-47 carried 8 50 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing. When all 8 fired simultaneously, the recoil was enough to slow the aircraft to shake it like a wet dog. He'd once seen a Thunderbolt pilot fire a burst so long that the wing panels buckled from the heat and vibration. The guns generated over 4,000 rounds per minute of combined fire. When that weight of metal intersected with an enemy aircraft, the results were absolute. 6,000 feet. 5, 4. The trailing Zero pilot saw him. Pappy watched the man's head snap around, saw the aircraft jerk as the pilot realized death was diving out of the sun at terminal velocity. The Japanese pilot tried to break right, tried to roll away, but he was flying a loaded reconnaissance bird, and Pappy was in a 50 caliber Avalanche. Pappy pressed the trigger. The Thunderbolt shook. Tracers reached out like fingers of light. The Zero's wing crumpled. Not slowly. There was nothing gradual about it. One moment there was an aircraft, the next there was a disintegrating cloud of metal and fabric tumbling toward the ocean 3,000 feet below. He didn't have time to watch it fall. The formation was scattering now, the remaining 7 Zeros breaking in all directions like a kicked anthill. Pappy pulled back on the stick, fighting the dive, feeling the G-forces crush him into his seat. His vision tunneled. Gray crept in from the edges. The Thunderbolt leveled out at 2,000 feet, and Pappy's vision cleared just in time to see another Zero crossing directly in front of him. The pilot so focused on escaping upward that he'd forgotten to check his 6. The second burst was shorter, cleaner. The rounds walked up the Zero's fuselage from tail to cockpit, and the aircraft nosed over into an uncontrolled dive. No fire, no explosion, just the sudden absence of a pilot's hand on the controls. Pappy's altitude was wrong now. He was down in the weeds, and Zeros could outturn anything America built at low altitude. Above him, his squad mates were finally committing to the fight, diving in from their careful positions. But Pappy was alone down here with 6 angry Japanese pilots who just watched 2 of their friends die in the span of 15 seconds. The farm had taught him something else. When you're in the wrong position, don't try to defend it. Move. He shoved the throttle to the firewall and pointed the Thunderbolt's nose at the horizon. The P-47 accelerated like a falling anvil. Zeros were faster in a climb, faster in a turn, but in straight-line speed at low altitude, the Thunderbolt could outrun almost anything. The engine howled. The airframe shook. Behind him, 3 Zeros gave chase. Their pilots either brave or furious or both. Pappy counted seconds. 1, 2, 3. The Zeros were gaining, closing the gap, their lighter frames and less powerful engines somehow finding extra knots. At 4 seconds, the lead Zero opened fire. Pappy saw the muzzle flashes, saw tracers arc past his canopy. At 5 seconds, he hauled back on the stick and climbed. The Thunderbolt had one more trick. It could dive like a stone and it could climb like a homesick angel if you had enough speed built up. Pappy had speed. The nose came up. The altimeter spun forward. 1,000 feet, 1,500, 2,000. The 3 Zeros tried to follow, but they'd been at full throttle already and didn't have the energy reserve. They fell behind, their climb shallower, their frustration almost visible. At 4,000 feet, Pappy rolled inverted and looked down. The 3 Zeros were scattered, their formation broken, their pursuit abandoned. Above them, his squad mates were engaging the remaining 3 Japanese fighters. He watched 1 Zero erupt in flames as a Thunderbolt's guns found its fuel tank. Another spun away trailing smoke. The third broke for the deck and ran, its pilot deciding that discretion beat valor when the odds went from 8 on 8 to 1 on 6. Pappy rolled upright and keyed his radio. Splash 8 confirmed. Scratch that. 7 confirmed, 1 probable. His squadron leader's voice came back, tight with anger and something else. Respect, maybe. Or just relief that the crazy bastard was still alive. Pappy, you just violated every tactical doctrine in the manual. Yes, sir. Don't ever do it again. Yes, sir. And good shooting. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The debriefing happened on the deck of the USS Hornet, the carrier that served as their floating home. Pappy sat in a folding chair while a young intelligence officer, couldn't have been more than 22, fresh from some college ROTC program, asked him to recount every detail of the engagement: time, altitude, aircraft type, angle of attack. The kid wrote everything down in a neat hand, filling out forms that would eventually make their way to Washington and be filed in a basement somewhere. Forgotten. What the forms didn't capture was the smell. Pappy's flight suit reeked of sweat and gun smoke, and underneath that was the sweet, sick odor of hydraulic fluid that had leaked from a severed line during the pullout from his dive. The Thunderbolt had taken damage, nothing critical, but the crew chief had given him a look that promised a long conversation about airframe stress limits and what happened to pilots who exceeded them. The squadron leader, Major Frank Donnelly, was a West Point graduate who'd flown in North Africa before transferring to the Pacific. He believed in the manual, in coordination, in the careful application of overwhelming force. He did not believe in farm boys from Kansas turning individual dogfights into personal crusades. "You could have been killed," Donnelly said after the intelligence officer left. "You went in alone, without support, without coordination. If those Zeros had been better pilots, we'd be fishing your body out of the ocean right now." Pappy nodded. There wasn't much to say to that because it was true. "But they weren't better pilots," Donnelly continued. "They were green kids who panicked when you came out of the sun like the wrath of God. You broke their formation before they knew what hit them. By the time the rest of us arrived, you'd already done the hard work. Just lucky, sir. Luck runs out, Pappy. Skill doesn't." Donnelly pulled out a cigarette, offered one to Pappy. They smoked in silence for a moment, watching the deck crew work on a Hellcat that had caught a wire too hard and bent its landing gear. "You've got good instincts. I've seen enough pilots to know the difference between someone who's reckless and someone who sees angles nobody else sees. But instinct only keeps you alive if you're around long enough to use it." The conversation, Donnelly wasn't one for... He'd made his point, and now it was up to Pappy to decide whether to listen. That night, Pappy lay in his rack and stared at the bottom of the bunk above him. Sleep didn't come easy anymore. It never did after combat. His mind kept replaying the dive, the moment when he'd committed to the attack, the instant when careful planning gave way to pure reaction. He kept seeing that first Zero's wing crumple, kept wondering if the pilot had time to know what was happening, or if death came too fast for fear. The farm had taught him about death too. Livestock died, crops failed. His mother had lost 2 children to scarlet fever before Pappy was born. Babies he'd never met, but whose photographs sat on the mantle like ghosts. Death was part of life, his father used to say. You respected it, you prepared for it, but you didn't let fear of it stop you from doing what needed doing. But there was a difference between a calf dying of pneumonia and shooting another human being out of the sky. The manual tried to depersonalize it, tried to make enemy aircraft into targets and enemy pilots into threats rather than people. It didn't work. Pappy knew that on the other side of those gun sites were farm boys too, kids who'd left home and learned to fly, and now found themselves in a war they probably didn't fully understand, fighting for causes that seemed increasingly abstract as the bullets started flying. The crazy thing was that he didn't hate them, didn't even dislike them. They were doing their job, same as him. The real enemy was the war itself, the machine that ground up farm boys from Kansas and farm boys from Kyushu, and spit out widows and orphans and men who'd never sleep quite right again. But the war was too big to fight. You couldn't shoot it down or outmaneuver it. All you could do was survive it, one mission at a time, and try to make sure the guy next to you survived too. 3 days later, they flew another patrol. This time, Pappy stayed in formation, followed the manual, coordinated his attacks. They didn't see any enemy aircraft. The sky was empty except for clouds and the occasional albatross riding the thermals. It felt wrong somehow, anticlimactic, like showing up for a gunfight and finding an abandoned street. The war was winding down. Everyone could feel it. The scuttlebutt said the invasion of Japan was coming, that they'd be flying ground support missions over Tokyo by autumn, that the casualties would make Normandy look like a Sunday picnic. But there was other scuttlebutt too, whispers about some kind of new weapon, something so terrible that it might end the war without invasion. Nobody knew what to believe. The only certainty was uncertainty. Pappy flew 42 combat missions in the Pacific Theater. He shot down 7 confirmed enemy aircraft and damaged 4 others. He never got shot down himself, though he came close twice. Once when a Zero put 3 rounds through his engine cowling, and once when a ground-based anti-aircraft battery bracketed him with flak that shredded his rudder and left his Thunderbolt flying sideways for the last 50 miles back to the carrier. After the war ended, after the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, after the Emperor's surrender broadcast, after the formal ceremony on the deck of the Missouri, Pappy went home to Kansas. The farm was still there. His father was older, grayer, but still checking every bolt twice. His mother cried when she saw him, and then got angry that he was too thin, and then cried some more. The town threw a parade. There were speeches about heroism and sacrifice and the American spirit. The mayor gave him a plaque. Pretty girls looked at him with admiration that made him uncomfortable because they were seeing someone who didn't quite exist, a hero from a newsreel, rather than a farm boy who'd gotten lucky more times than he deserved. He tried to go back to farming. He really did, but the fields were too quiet. The sky was too empty. At night, he'd wake up from dreams of diving through clouds, of tracers arcing toward his canopy, of that first Zero's wing crumpling like paper. His hands would shake until he could smell cordite and hydraulic fluid again, until the dream felt more real than the bedroom. 6 months after coming home, Pappy re-enlisted. His father didn't understand. His mother tried not to show her disappointment, but Pappy couldn't explain it in a way that made sense to people who hadn't been there. The war had changed him, had given him a purpose and a skill set that didn't translate to peacetime farming. More than that, it had shown him a version of himself he hadn't known existed, someone who could make impossible decisions in the space of a heartbeat, who could trust his instincts when the manual failed, who could dive into chaos and come out the other side. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. He flew in Korea. Different war, different enemy, different aircraft. The Thunderbolt was obsolete now, replaced by jets that could break the sound barrier and climb to altitudes where the air was too thin to breathe. But the fundamentals remained the same. Stay fast, stay unpredictable, trust your training, but don't be a slave to it. By the time Vietnam started heating up, Pappy was too old for combat duty. They made him an instructor instead, teaching young pilots the difference between aggressive and reckless, between confident and cocky. He told them about the dive over the Philippine Sea, about splitting a Japanese formation before his squadmates could react, about the moment when calculated risk became something else entirely. Some of them got it, some didn't. The ones who didn't usually didn't last long. War had a way of weeding out the slow learners. Pappy retired from the Air Force in 1973 with the rank of colonel. He'd spent 30 years in uniform, had flown more combat missions than he could accurately count, had trained hundreds of pilots who'd gone on to fly in wars he'd never heard of when he was bombing Zeros into the ocean. He went back to Kansas one last time, to the farm that had been sold years earlier, and stood in the empty fields where he'd learned about risk and caution and the price of hesitation. The wheat was still growing. Different farmer, same soil, same seasons, cycling through planting and harvest and fallow. The land didn't care who worked it or who died defending it. It just was, patient and indifferent, outlasting wars and warriors alike. He thought about the Zero pilot, the first one, the kid whose wing had crumpled under 8 streams of 50 caliber fire. Pappy had never learned his name, never would. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, he wondered if that pilot had come from a farm too, wondered if his family had thrown a parade when he left for the war, wondered if his mother had cried. The war had made them enemies. Time and distance had made them something else. Not friends, that was too simple, too clean. But maybe fellow travelers, farm boys who'd been caught up in something bigger than themselves and had done what they thought was necessary at the time. Right or wrong didn't enter into it. Survival did. Duty did. The belief that your actions mattered, that your choices could tip the balance, even if only for a moment. Pappy never regretted the dive, never second-guessed the decision to break formation and attack alone. But he never glorified it either. It was what it was, a split-second choice made by a 23-year-old farm boy from Kansas who saw an opportunity and took it. Consequences be damned. 7 enemy aircraft destroyed or damaged. 1 intelligence-gathering flight disrupted. 1 tactical doctrine violated. 1 pilot who learned that sometimes the manual gets you killed, and sometimes ignoring it does the same. And the only way to know the difference is to make the call and live with the results. Years later, when they interviewed him for a military history project, Pappy was asked what he'd learned from his time in combat. He thought about it for a long moment, trying to distill 3 wars and thousands of flight hours into something coherent. "I learned that fear is useful," he finally said. "It keeps you sharp, keeps you from getting complacent, but you can't let it make your decisions for you. I learned that the guy next to you matters more than the medal on your chest. I learned that war is waste. Waste of life, waste of potential, waste of all the things those dead pilots might have done if they'd lived. And I learned that sometimes you have to make impossible choices with incomplete information and live with the consequences, whether they turn out right or wrong." The interviewer asked if he considered himself a hero. Pappy laughed. It was a short, bitter sound. "Heroes are for movies and recruiting posters. I was just a farm boy who learned to fly and got lucky more often than I deserved. The real heroes are the ones who didn't come home. The ones who died doing their duty without recognition or reward. I got to grow old. That makes me fortunate, not heroic." But he kept the plaque from the mayor, kept his medals too, locked in a box in the garage where he didn't have to look at them but knew they were there. They weren't souvenirs exactly, more like evidence, proof that it had happened, that he'd been there, that the choices he'd made had consequences that rippled forward through time. The dive had lasted maybe 20 seconds from start to finish. 20 seconds during which James Boyington stopped being a careful farmer's son and became something else. Someone who could look at chaos and see opportunity, who could trust his instincts over his training, who could commit absolutely to a course of action and deal with the fallout later. In those 20 seconds, 8 Japanese pilots saw death diving out of the sun. 7 of them didn't survive the encounter. The 8th made it home, landed his damaged aircraft, and presumably filed a report about the American pilot who'd attacked like a madman, with no regard for tactics or self-preservation. That pilot's report is probably still filed in a basement somewhere in Tokyo, forgotten like Pappy's debriefings in Washington. 2 pieces of paper documenting the same event from different perspectives, neither one capturing the full truth of what happened when a farm boy from Kansas decided that careful wasn't going to cut it and pushed his thunderbolt into a dive that violated every tactical doctrine in the manual. The thing about tactical doctrines is that they're written by people who survived. The dead don't get to contribute their lessons. So the manual reflects a kind of survivorship bias, encoding the decisions that worked for the people who lived long enough to write things down. But war isn't a textbook. It's chaos and confusion and split-second decisions made with incomplete information and adrenaline screaming through your veins. Sometimes the manual is right. Sometimes it gets you killed. The trick is knowing which is which before you commit. Pappy died in 1998 at the age of 76. Heart attack. Quick and relatively painless, which is about as much as anyone can ask for. They buried him in a military cemetery with full honors. The rifle salute echoed across the rows of white headstones, and a bugler played taps while his grandchildren stood at attention, wearing uniforms of their own. One of them was a Navy pilot. Another was Army infantry, recently back from somewhere in the Middle East that Pappy had never heard of when he was young. The wars kept happening. Different enemies, different weapons, but the same fundamental reality. Farm boys and city kids and everyone in between, learning to kill and trying not to die, making impossible choices and living with the consequences. On Pappy's headstone, beneath his name and rank and service dates, they inscribed a single line. He did his duty. Not a hero, not a legend, just a man who showed up when called and did what he thought was necessary at the time. The dive over the Philippine Sea became a case study at the Air Force Academy. Instructors used it to illustrate the tension between doctrine and instinct, between calculated risk and recklessness. Some taught it as an example of brilliant tactical improvisation. Others taught it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of breaking formation. Both perspectives had merit. Neither captured the full truth. The full truth was simpler and more complex than any tactical analysis could convey. A 23-year-old farm boy saw 8 enemy aircraft and made a choice. The choice worked out. 7 enemy pilots died. Pappy lived, that's all. That's everything. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The Thunderbolt Pappy flew that day, Bureau number 42367, survived the war. It was shipped back to the States, served briefly as a training aircraft, and eventually ended up in a museum in Ohio, restored to pristine condition, sitting behind velvet ropes with a placard describing its service record. 14 confirmed kills between various pilots who'd flown it. 47 missions. 3 Purple Hearts earned by men who'd brought it home, damaged but flying. The museum placard doesn't mention the dive, doesn't mention Pappy by name, just lists statistics and dates, reducing war to numbers that fit neatly on an information card. School children walk past it every day, more interested in the newer jets, the missiles and stealth fighters that represent modern warfare. The Thunderbolt is history, a relic from a war their great-grandparents fought. But the lessons Pappy learned in that cockpit remain relevant. War changes, technology evolves, but the human element stays constant. Fear, courage, the weight of impossible choices, the knowledge that your decisions have consequences that ripple forward, touching lives you'll never know about. There's no way to know how many lives were saved by disrupting that Japanese reconnaissance flight. Maybe the intelligence they were carrying would have been worthless. Maybe it would have led to an ambush that killed dozens of American sailors. The counterfactuals are endless and unknowable. All Pappy could do was make the choice that seemed right at the time and live with the outcome. That's true for all of us. Whether we're diving thunderbolts into enemy formations or just trying to navigate the daily complexities of civilian life, we make choices with incomplete information. We take risks. Sometimes they pay off, sometimes they don't. The key is to make the choice deliberately, to own it, and to accept the consequences without excuse or deflection. Pappy understood that. The farm had taught him, the war had reinforced it, and the years after had given him time to reflect on the difference between recklessness and calculated risk, between breaking rules for the sake of rebellion and breaking them because the situation demanded something outside the manual. His wingman from that day, a pilot named Eddie Kowalski from Pittsburgh, survived the war too. He and Pappy stayed in touch for decades, exchanging Christmas cards and occasional phone calls. Eddie had been furious about the dive at first, terrified that his wingman had just committed suicide in front of him. But after the debriefing, after seeing the gun camera footage and the intelligence assessment, he came around. "You saw something the rest of us missed," Eddie told him years later, over beers at a reunion. "I don't know what it was. Maybe just instinct. Maybe you got lucky, but you turned a standard intercept into a rout. 8 zeros. And we didn't lose a single bird. That's not recklessness. That's something else." Pappy shrugged. Could have gone the other way just as easy, but it didn't. That's the point. You made the call and it worked. They drank to that, to calls that worked, to wingmen who survived, to farm boys who learned to fly and somehow made it home. Eddie died in the early 90s. Cancer, long and painful. Pappy visited him in the hospital, sat by his bed while Eddie slept, morphine keeping the worst of the pain at bay. They didn't talk much during those visits. Didn't need to. They'd said everything that mattered decades earlier, in cockpits and debriefing rooms and at reunions where the beer flowed, and the war stories got bigger with each retelling. On one of the last visits, Eddie opened his eyes and looked at Pappy with an intensity that cut through the medication haze. "You know what I remember most about that day?" he asked. Pappy waited. "Your voice on the radio after the fight. You were calm, like you just finished a training run instead of shredding half a Japanese squadron. I remember thinking, that's the difference between us. I was scared shitless the whole time. You were just working. I was scared too," Pappy said. "Just didn't have time to think about it until after." Eddie smiled. "That's the trick, isn't it? Not having time to think. Just react. Trust your training and your instinct and sort out the philosophy later. They sat in silence after that. A week later, Eddie was gone. Pappy attended the funeral, stood at attention while they folded the flag, watched Eddie's granddaughter accept it with trembling hands. Another warrior down. Another voice from the war years silenced. The generation was dying. Every year there were fewer of them. Fewer men and women who remembered what it felt like to be young in a world at war, who'd made impossible choices and carried the weight of them forward through decades of peace. Eventually, there would be none left. Just museums and history books and documentaries narrated by people who'd never heard a P-47's engine roar or felt the stick shake when all 850s fired at once. Pappy knew his time was limited too. His heart was failing. The doctors gave him medications and advice about diet and exercise, but he could feel the machinery winding down. Soon enough, he'd join Eddie and all the others, the long roll call of the dead growing by one more name. He didn't fear it. Death was just the next mission, the final deployment. He'd lived longer than he had any right to expect. 7 enemy pilots hadn't been so fortunate. Neither had thousands of other young men who'd climbed into cockpits and never climbed out. Pappy had been given decades they'd been denied. He'd gotten to grow old, to watch his children have children, to see the world change in ways both wonderful and terrible. When the end came, it was quick. One moment he was sitting in his chair, reading a book about the Battle of Midway. The next, his heart simply stopped. No pain, no dramatic final words, just the gentle transition from life to whatever comes after. They found him the next morning, the book still open in his lap. The passage he'd been reading was about dive bombers attacking Japanese carriers, about pilots pushing through anti-aircraft fire to drop their payloads on flight decks packed with fueled and armed aircraft, about impossible courage in the face of certain death. Pappy would have appreciated the symmetry. The funeral was well attended. His family came, of course, old Air Force buddies, a surprising number of former students, pilots he'd trained decades earlier, who'd stayed in touch, who'd learned from him not just how to fly, but how to think about the relationship between doctrine and instinct. They told stories. Some of them were even true. The dive came up naturally. It always did. The 20 seconds that defined Pappy's war, the moment when careful calculation gave way to pure warrior instinct. Everyone had a different interpretation. The tacticians emphasized the risk analysis, the split-second evaluation of enemy formation and friendly positioning. The psychologists talked about stress response and decision-making under pressure. The historians placed it in the broader context of Pacific air combat and the evolution of fighter tactics. All of them were right. All of them were missing something. The truth was that Pappy had seen an opportunity and taken it. No complex analysis, no careful weighing of pros and cons, just recognition and reaction, the kind of immediate understanding that comes from talent and training and something else, some indefinable quality that separates adequate pilots from great ones. Call it instinct, call it intuition, call it the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 hours in the cockpit and a childhood spent learning to read situations and make decisions. Whatever it was, Pappy had it. And on that July day in 1945, it kept him alive and killed 7 men who had the misfortune to be his enemy. The war made that possible. The structure of military conflict, the clear delineation of friend and enemy, the moral framework that justified killing in service of a larger cause. Without the war, Pappy would have been just another farm boy, living a quiet life on the Kansas plains, never knowing what he was capable of when necessity demanded. Was that better or worse? Impossible to say. The war destroyed him in some ways, gave him nightmares and survivor's guilt and a restlessness that never quite faded, but it also showed him capacities he'd never have discovered otherwise, gave him a sense of purpose and belonging that civilian life couldn't replicate. In the end, he was grateful for it. Not grateful for the war itself. That was too monstrous, too destructive to inspire anything but regret. But grateful for having been tested, for having discovered that when everything was on the line, he could make the call and live with the consequences. That's what the dive represented ultimately. Not heroism or recklessness or brilliant tactics. Just a farm boy from Kansas making a choice and owning it, accepting both the praise and the criticism that followed, never apologizing and never boasting. He'd done what seemed necessary at the time. 7 men died because of it. That was the reality. Neither good nor bad, just true. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The years after the funeral brought changes. Pappy's children sold his house, distributed his possessions, donated his uniform and medals to a military museum. The placard from the mayor ended up in a box in someone's attic, forgotten. The letters he'd written home from the war were preserved in an archive, available to researchers studying the Pacific Theater or the daily life of fighter pilots. But the dive itself lived on, passed from instructor to student. Generation after generation of pilots, learning about the man who'd broken formation and shredded a Japanese squadron before his wingmen could react. Some learned the right lessons. Others learned something different. That was okay. Pappy would have understood. People take from stories what they need, not necessarily what the storyteller intended. The Thunderbolt in the Ohio Museum still sits behind its velvet rope, gleaming under carefully positioned lights. The placard has been updated a few times, adding context about the pilots who flew it, the missions they completed. Pappy's name is there now, a footnote in the aircraft's history. Museum visitors read it, take photos, move on to the next exhibit. None of them will ever know what it felt like to push that stick forward, to commit to a dive that could have ended in a fiery crash, to feel the aircraft shake as 850s hammered lead into enemy aircraft. They won't know the smell or the fear or the strange calm that comes over you when training and instinct take over and conscious thought becomes a luxury you can't afford. That knowledge died with Pappy and Eddie and all the others. The experience is gone, preserved only in pale imitations, written accounts and gun camera footage and carefully curated museum exhibits. Future generations will study the war, will learn the tactics and strategies and outcomes, but they won't feel it in their bones the way the men who were there did. Maybe that's for the best. War shouldn't be glorified or romanticized. The costs are too high, the wounds too deep. Better that it remain history, something studied and remembered but not repeated. Still, there's something to be learned from men like Pappy. Not about war specifically, but about making choices under pressure, about trusting yourself when the manual fails, about owning the consequences of your actions without excuse or deflection. Those lessons transcend the specifics of aerial combat over the Pacific. They apply to anyone facing difficult decisions with incomplete information and limited time. Doctor in an emergency room, firefighter in a burning building, parent making impossible choices about a child's welfare. The contexts differ, but the fundamental challenge remains the same. Make the call, accept the outcome, keep moving forward. Pappy would have hated being turned into a symbol. He was too practical for that, too aware of his own limitations. But symbols are for the living, not the dead. We need heroes and cautionary tales, need stories that illustrate principles and values. Whether Pappy wanted the role or not, his 20-second dive became one of those stories, a touchstone for discussions about doctrine and instinct, rules and innovation. The irony is that Pappy probably would have preferred to be remembered for his work as an instructor, for the hundreds of pilots he trained, and the lives he saved by teaching them to survive. The dive was spectacular, but his teaching was meaningful. It rippled forward, creating effects that lasted decades after the war ended. But history remembers the spectacular, not the patient work of incremental improvement. We remember the dive, not the thousands of hours spent in classrooms and simulators, teaching young pilots the difference between confident and cocky. That's human nature. We're drawn to drama, to decisive moments, to turning points where everything changes. And the dive was a turning point, at least for Pappy. It proved something to him, demonstrated that he could trust himself in the crucible. That knowledge sustained him through Korea and Vietnam and all the years between, through missions and training flights and the grinding daily routine of military life. He'd been tested and hadn't been found wanting. That mattered. On quiet nights near the end, Pappy sometimes thought about the Zero pilot, the first one, the kid whose wing crumpled. He wondered if that pilot had family waiting, if his death left holes in other people's lives the way Eddie's death had left a hole in Pappy's. He wondered if the pilot's mother got a telegram, if his siblings told stories about him at family gatherings, if his name was carved on some memorial halfway around the world. The wondering didn't change anything. The pilot was still dead, and Pappy's bullets had killed him. That was the reality, unalterable and absolute. But the wondering was important anyway, a reminder that the enemy had been human too. That war made killers of farm boys regardless of which flag they served. Pappy never spoke about this to anyone. It felt disloyal somehow, weak. You weren't supposed to humanize the enemy, weren't supposed to question the necessity of your actions. But in the privacy of his own thoughts, in the space between sleep and waking, he allowed himself the luxury of doubt, of recognizing that maybe there weren't good guys and bad guys, just scared kids doing what they were told and hoping to survive. That doubt didn't paralyze him. He'd still made the dive, still pressed the trigger, still killed 7 men without hesitation. But the doubt kept him honest, kept him from glorifying war or pretending that killing was somehow noble when it was really just necessary. In his final years, Pappy received letters from historians and authors, people researching the Pacific War, or writing biographies of fighter aces. They wanted interviews, wanted his perspective on tactics and technology and the evolution of aerial combat. He answered most of them, polite, but brief. He didn't have much to add to the official record, didn't see the point of rehashing old stories for the entertainment of people who hadn't been there. But one letter was different. It came from Japan, from a researcher trying to identify Japanese pilots who'd been killed or gone missing during the war. The researcher had found records of a flight that had disappeared on the right date in the right location, 8 zeros that never returned to base. He was hoping Pappy could provide details that might help identify the pilots, give their families closure after 50 years. Pappy spent a long time with that letter. He wanted to help, truly. But what could he say? He hadn't known their names then, and didn't know them now. He'd killed them efficiently and moved on, because that was his job, and dwelling on it would have gotten him killed in turn. Providing details would help the families, yes. But it would also memorialize his actions in a Japanese archive, permanently linking his name to the deaths of men who'd been doing their duty same as him. In the end, he sent a brief response confirming the date and location, but declining to provide specifics about the engagement. Let the families wonder. Let them imagine their sons and brothers died bravely, quickly, without suffering. That was kinder than the truth, which was that most of them probably died terrified and confused, never understanding what hit them. The researcher wrote back thanking him and explaining that several families had been waiting decades for information about their missing son. The letter included a photo, black and white, showing a young Japanese pilot standing next to a zero. He looked barely old enough to shave, wearing his flight suit with obvious pride, smiling at the camera. Pappy kept that photo, put it in his wallet, next to pictures of his own grandchildren. He never explained why to anyone who asked, but on quiet nights, he'd take it out and look at it, studying the young pilot's face, wondering if this was one of the 7, wondering what that kid had been thinking when he climbed into his cockpit for the last time, wondering if he'd been scared or excited or just grimly determined to do his duty. The photo remained in Pappy's wallet when he died. His family found it during the funeral preparations, had no idea who the Japanese pilot was or why their father had carried his picture for years. They debated what to do with it, eventually deciding to include it in the casket. Let Pappy carry it wherever he was going next. Maybe he'd explain it to the pilot personally, assuming there was an afterlife and assuming it worked that way. It seemed fitting somehow. The Farmboy and the enemy pilot, joined by a 20-second engagement that had defined one man's life and ended another's. Two sides of the same coin, warriors bound together by violence and circumstance and the strange intimacy that comes from killing and being killed. The dive over the Philippine Sea lasted 20 seconds. Its consequences rippled forward through decades, touching lives across continents and generations. 7 men died. 1 man lived and carried the weight of that survival until his heart gave out 53 years later. A museum preserves the aircraft, archives store the reports, and somewhere in a cemetery in Kansas, a headstone marks the resting place of a farm boy who made an impossible choice and lived with it until he didn't have to anymore. That's the story. Not heroic, not evil, just human, complicated and contradictory, and absolutely true. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The thing about legacy is that you don't control it. Pappy learned that lesson slowly, watching how his story changed in the retelling, how each generation of pilots took something different from the dive, shaped it to fit their needs and their times. In the 1950s, when Strategic Air Command dominated Air Force thinking, instructors used the dive as a cautionary tale. See what happens when you break formation? See how individual heroics disrupt the mission? The emphasis was on coordination, on the bomber formations that would theoretically deliver nuclear payloads deep into Soviet territory. Fighter pilots were supposed to escort, to protect, not to go hunting glory on their own. Pappy sat through some of those lectures, never said a word, just listened to younger officers who'd never fired a shot in anger, explain what he'd done wrong, why his approach was outdated, unsuited to modern warfare. They weren't entirely wrong. The world had changed. Nuclear weapons had altered the calculus of conflict, but they weren't entirely right either, and time would prove that. Vietnam changed the narrative. Suddenly, the Air Force was fighting a war that looked nothing like the nuclear scenarios they'd been planning for. Close air support, interdiction missions, dogfights with MiGs over Hanoi. The doctrine that emphasized rigid formation flying and bomber protection didn't translate well to the jungles and rice paddies of Southeast Asia. Young pilots started asking different questions. How do you adapt when the situation doesn't match the man? When do you break the rules? How do you make split-second decisions when headquarters is thousands of miles away and every second counts? Suddenly, the dive over the Philippine Sea wasn't a cautionary tale anymore. It was a case study in tactical flexibility, in the kind of aggressive improvisation that won fights. Pappy watched that shift too, watched his actions get reinterpreted through a new lens. turned into justification for tactics he wasn't sure he'd endorse. Some of the young hotshots coming back from Vietnam were reckless in ways that made his dive look cautious by comparison. They'd taken the wrong lesson, confused confidence with invincibility, forgotten that luck eventually runs out. He tried to explain the difference when they asked. "I wasn't trying to be a hero," he'd tell them. "I saw a tactical opportunity and I took it. But I also knew my aircraft, knew its limits, knew what it could and couldn't do, and I was willing to accept the consequences if I was wrong." That's not the same as just doing whatever feels exciting in the moment. Some understood, others didn't. That was the problem with being a symbol. People saw what they wanted to see, heard what they wanted to hear. The actual man, with his doubts and his nightmares and his complicated relationship with what he'd done, got lost in the mythology. The letters kept coming over the years. School children writing reports, graduate students working on dissertations, journalists chasing human interest stories. All of them wanted the same thing: a clean narrative, a hero's tale, inspiration wrapped in red, white, and blue bunting. Pappy did his best to give them something useful, but he suspected most of them went away disappointed. Real life was messier than they wanted, full of ambiguity and uncertainty, and questions without clean answers. One letter stood out. It came in 1978 from a Japanese man about Pappy's age. The man identified himself as the brother of one of the Zero pilots, the reconnaissance bird that Pappy had been so certain was carrying valuable intelligence. The brother had spent decades researching what happened to his sibling, piecing together the story from fragmentary records and eyewitness accounts. The letter was polite, formal. The brother explained that he wasn't angry, wasn't looking for an apology, or seeking some kind of reconciliation. He just wanted to know. His brother had left for the mission one morning and never returned. Their mother had died, still wondering what happened, whether death had been quick, whether her son had suffered. The brother wanted to give his own children, the nephews and nieces who'd never met their uncle, some kind of concrete answer about what had happened to him. Pappy read that letter a dozen times, sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold while he tried to figure out how to respond. What did you say to a man whose brother you'd killed? How did you explain that yes, the death had been quick, that the Zero had come apart so fast the pilot probably never knew what hit him? Was that comfort or just another wound? He wrote back. Kept it simple. Confirmed the date and approximate location. Described the engagement in clinical terms: altitude, aircraft type, approximate time of day. He explained that based on the position in the formation, the pilot had been flying a reconnaissance aircraft, which meant he'd been a trained observer, probably well educated, certainly brave to be flying alone so far from home. Pappy said the death had been instantaneous, that there was no suffering, that the pilot had been doing his duty honorably. He didn't mention that he'd fired the burst, didn't identify himself as the killer, just described it as a combat engagement between American and Japanese forces, keeping himself out of the narrative as much as possible. Let the brother have his answers, without forcing him to personalize the enemy who'd taken his sibling's life. The brother wrote back one more time, a brief note thanking him for the information, explaining that it had brought closure to his family. The letter ended with a line that Pappy never forgot. "War makes enemies of men who would otherwise have been friends. I am grateful that your war and mine is over." Pappy kept both letters, filed them with his other correspondence, the accumulated paper trail of a long life. Sometimes he'd pull them out and reread them, reminded of the human cost hidden behind the tactical assessments and the victory statistics. 7 enemy aircraft destroyed, but also 7 families torn apart, 7 futures erased, 7 collections of hopes and dreams and potential contributions to the world, simply gone. The weight of that never got lighter. If anything, it got heavier as he aged, as he watched his own children grow and have children of their own. He understood now, in a way he hadn't at 23, what it meant to lose a son or a brother, the hole it left in a family, the way grief changed people, made them smaller or harder, or just permanently damaged. But he also understood that dwelling on it would dishonor the choice he'd made. He'd seen a threat. He'd neutralized it. 7 enemy pilots died, but how many American lives did that save? What intelligence was lost when that reconnaissance bird went down? What attacks were prevented? What ambushes avoided? The counterfactuals ran both ways.